So in this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this custom shot ski. This was a gift for someone, a gift from myself for someone. I didn't make it for someone to give as a gift. If you're not familiar with shot skis, it's basically a inventive way to take a shot. This is a 4-person one. Obviously there's 4 holes. I've seen people on Etsy make these out of just regular planks, and I'm not knocking that design, but I believe this actually originated by gluing shot glasses to a ski, which would be the easiest way to make one of these if you happen to have a ski laying around. But I wanted mine to resemble more so of an actual ski, so I did a little bit of 3-dimensional carving to give myself the tips on the end of this and make it replicate a ski a little bit more. There's some custom engravings in this, which I will show in the video, but because it was a gift, I kind of go through that somewhat quickly. And the fact that this is alcohol related explains the title. So that is basically it. This is only going to be one video because it was a pretty simple build, and then next week we'll be back onto something else. So I started by ripping down parts of a 2x6 to get the dimensions I wanted. I like to work with dimensional grade lumber. I prefer this Douglas fir. It's a nicer grade of lumber. It finishes nicer. It's easy to work with than some of the white woods available. I cut this down to rough size, and a new habit I have in the shop is I turn on the video after I'm done. So you can see I was showing the tail end of cutting that. This is pretty simple. I will show a little bit later the dimensions. I forget exactly what it was, but I just cut off the 2 ends. I like to cut off both ends versus just one side, so I'm left with the nicer material in the middle. And then I started roughing out my dimensions. So I found center, which is 3 feet. So then that means this is 6 foot long. I marked center, and that is going to be 1.5 inches on either side because I want this middle part, which will be the skinniest part, to be 3 inches. Like I said, I am copying a ski. It's a little more stylized than an actual ski. It's obviously going to be a little bit thicker than an actual ski, but in general, the design, I found a picture, which is this is it. It's a twin tip ski of the one I wanted to copy, and that was kind of roughly what I was working off of. So it kind of flares at the ends and tapers in the middle, and those are the rough dimensions I was going with. So it's 3 inches in the middle, and it will flare out to 4 inches on the end. So same concept as when I rough cut this down. I cut off both ends. To get this down to size, I'm going to rip off both edges. The edges on all this dimensional lumber is going to be rounded over because it's used for construction, and they don't want those square edges. So that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to remove both edges. This is a 2x6, which means in real dimensions is about 1.5 inches thick by about 5.5 inches wide. So to cut it down to 4, I'm taking about 3/4 of an inch off of each side. Now I had just done a project where I was ripping down dimensional lumber. I had some pieces left over, and you can see the one I'm playing with is about 1/4 inch thick, and that was a little too thin. I did want this to be structural. I didn't want it to flop around, so I decided to make this about 3/8 of an inch thick. I didn't want it to be too thick because then it wouldn't look like a ski at all. It would just look like a board, but too thin and you're going to have issues with it warping and even potentially cracking if you get it too long, because it is quite long of a piece. So if there's a weak spot in the center, I didn't want it to crack. So I went through and I just ripped off a very thin bit of the edge, so that what you see now is I'm working with a somewhat flat board. With dimensional lumber, unless you're going to spend the time to plane the stuff down, which I'm not for something like this, you're going to have a little bit of undulations in the surface when doing something like this. But I go through and I pick out as nice lumber as I could find, and you saw I ripped down that one side. Now that that side's flat, I could reference it off of my table saw edge and cut this down to 3/8 of an inch. So I'm only going halfway through the board, but there was this one cluster of knots at the edge which was giving me a little bit of trouble. This is one of the reasons I never listen to music when I'm using power tools. I could hear that the saw was bogging down, which is when I lifted it off the saw. and then I just went a little bit slower. You could see that cluster of knots, and I could get through the whole thing. So like I said, I'm cutting this in half. So I cut about halfway through on one side. I could flip it over, cut it halfway through on the other, and then I'll be left with my blank. And then there's a nice chunk of lumber left over. I always save this. I always end up using it, even if it's a year later in the shop. I really don't throw out a lot of scrap. So this is the board I'm going to be working with. And that's basically where I'm starting with the design. This is 6 foot long, 3/8 of an inch thick, and 4 inches wide. So in order to get that taper, I had a scrap piece of thin poplar I had laying around the shop, because I'm also working on a walk-in closet built in at this time. So all I did was tape it on my ends, and then tape it in the middle, marked where my line was. It creates that curve, and then I can mark that curve. So you can see I have it taped in. It's going to come about a 1/2 inch in from the edges and taped on either edge. There's multiple ways to do this. This is what I had laying around, and I can mark that with a pencil, and that is going to create the taper and the flare on the ski. I can lift it up, transfer it to the other side, and do the exact same thing. So a really easy way to create an arch on a board. And then it's hard to see because it is a very subtle curve, but that's what it looked like. So then my uncle gave me a bandsaw, and he had told me that the blades probably needed replacing, and they do. So I kind of struggled through cutting this on one side. You could see the blades dancing all around. So even though I struggled through on one side, I had to clean up the edge. So I used a spoke shave and some planes just to clean up that edge, get it down to where I needed it to be. Working around knots is always fun because the grain will change direction. But in general, I just needed to finish getting this to where it was. I should have used my jigsaw, which doesn't leave a super clean cut, but would have been much cleaner than that bandsaw. So you can see I'm just cleaning it up, flattening out that surface where I had all those issues. And then this is what that looks like. Like I said, it's a very subtle curve, which the camera doesn't pick up greatly. But when you sight it down the board, you could kind of see exactly how that angle and that curve looks. So that is what I'm working with. I'd clean this up a little bit more going forward with some sandpaper and my orbital, but in general, that's kind of the basic shape I was going for. So you can see now I'm going to sand down my marks. So for the ends, I didn't want to use 2x6s. I wanted it to be hardwood for the ends, even though I knew I was going to be painting them. I had this piece of sycamore scrap laying around the shop from a table I cut down years ago. That video is actually on this channel. And in order to make the ends, I'm basically going to make almost a flat bowl shape and then cut it in half to make my life easier instead of making two at once. So you can see I'm keeping the same thickness of 3/8 on the bottom, and I'm just creating the curve I want with a bucket around the shop. I draw that top side curve, and then I mark 3/8 of an inch, and I just make these curves intersect with that flat surface I had on the bottom. Circular objects around the shop are a great way to make these rough curves. Obviously, like I said, I want this to look like a ski, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So that is my rough dimensions there. And in order to remove the bulk of this material, I'm just going to cut a series of curves that will help remove most of the material on the inside. And once most of the material is removed, I could actually carve this. So you can see this flat part here is pretty simple. I could raise the blade right up to my line. The more curves you make with the closer they are together, the easier they are to remove. These are pretty thick as far as curves go, but this material is pretty easy to snap off. And then as I start getting towards the end, I could do about 3 cuts with the blade the height it is, and then I'll just have to keep gradually lowering the height of the blade in order to get to the end. And that's basically what I'm left with. And then I'm just going to lob off the ends. I believe I had this set to 45. I'm just going to cut off the ends a little bit. It's a little hard to see where my marks were, so I did a couple passes on both sides, creeped up on that mark, and cut all the way through. So you can see it's a couple little cuts to make sure I'm keeping it the way it is. And then I've been reviewing these discs I have in the shop for a while. I have one of these. This is a different company, so eventually that video will be coming out. These are great. They're a really quick way to remove material. That's what I'm using to finish up these curves. I broke away the rest of the material with a chisel, and then I could clean it up with these. You just have to be careful with these. If you've ever used a belt sander and you think that removes material quickly, this removes material 10 times faster. So I use a very light touch when I don't have far to go. And you can see my marks are already pretty close to my pencil marks. So I'm just very lightly removing all of this leftover material from the curve cut. So at this point, I'm not really shaping this as much as I'm just getting it to rough size. So I can flip it upside down and do the exact same thing on the other side. I could bring that edge to my mark and then gradually feather that dimension across the entire piece. So once again, I'm using a pretty light touch because this will remove material much faster than you probably think it does. And this is what I am left with. So this is roughly carved out. At this point, I can cut this in half, and then I'm not going to attach it just yet, but I'll have these edges. So like I said, I could cut this in half. You could see why I kept it in one piece. It was easier to carve that way. And you can see how good you're getting at carving by then comparing the two. And they're quite symmetrical at this point, so I was happy with that. And then, like I said, I'm going to make the cuts to attach these, but I'm not going to permanently attach them yet. The way I decided to attach these is essentially, you call it a tongue and groove, or it's a little bit thicker than that, so potentially an opened mortise and tenon. But that is how I didn't want to attach these with butt joints. It would pretty much guarantee it would fall apart. The material is so thin. So I wanted a more stable joint here. So all I'm doing is I'm going through and taking about a 16th, a little bit more than a 16th off of each side. I should have done this before I cut the shape on it. It would have been a safer cut because I need a flat surface against my fence. That's why I have that little shim there. That shim is making up for the fact that it's no longer square on the edges. But once I had that shim in place, you could see I could go through and remove that material. This is essentially like cutting a lap. And then at this point, this tongue that's sticking out is very thin, ton or tenon, depending on what you want to call it. So I was pretty fragile with it at this point, but once you put these end caps on, it became really, really sturdy. So same sort of concept, I just need to remove the opposite bit of material in order for that tongue to fit in place. To make this a little bit safer, I have this connected to a piece of wood that's riding along the top of my fence. And these are oversized at this point, the two ends. I knew I was still going to have some carving left to do, so they're about a 16th of an inch too big in each dimension. So I just went through, and like I said, this tenon at this point is a little under 1/4 of an inch. So I just went through and put a 1/4 inch groove or open-ended mortise through my piece, and then these two will attach. So at this point, pretty simple stuff. Carving the ends was the hardest part of this, which will probably give DIYers the most trouble, but I like the way it turned out. And then I just fit these in place. The reason I'm not attaching them is because I'm doing some laser engraving on this, and these fins stick up enough that I won't be able to slide it under the engraver. So I roughly marked out where the shot glasses were going to go. The recommendation I found online was to give yourself about 18 to 20 inches in between each one. So that's what I did. With the tips on, this is, I think, almost 7 feet long. So then the person I'm making this for really likes dogs, so I went through and I just engraved the entire front of it with dogs. You could see why I marked out where the shot glasses were going to go, because I didn't want to cut into any of that pattern. I also did some script on the other side. So then I could attach the ends at this point. When I was done with the engraver, I put a piece of blue tape on there. I didn't want anything to leak onto the board at this point. And then I let these set up overnight, and then I could finish carving these ends. So for this, like I showed in the original video, it's just going to have a blunt end. I think in my mind, I pictured that skis were pointed tips, and a lot of the photos online I saw blunt and or flat ends, so I tried to stick to that. Like I said, this isn't an exact replica, it's more stylized, but I did like the way that looked. And then because that bandsaw needs some fine tuning, I just cut my losses and cut off to my Sharpie mark with a jigsaw. I'm not removing a bunch of material. I think it's a 1/16 of an inch. And then I could also come down to the sides, because like I said, I made this all oversized, knowing I was going to trim it down later. And then like I said, I could just roughly cut this. This will all have to be cleaned up, but roughly cut this down to size. You're just going to save some time. Obviously, saws like this are going to remove material the fastest. Then that bit for my angle grinder is probably the second fastest. So you try and remove the bulk of the material first. So now this is what that looks like, and basically the shape is already where I want it. It's just a little too thick. It's about a 1/16 of an inch too thick all the way around. So all I'm going to do is the exact same process. I'm going to feather this into my edge there. As soon as I start to hit the blue tape, I know I've gone it as thick as I wanted, and I'm just going to clean this up, remove all the leftover kerf marks, because there still are some, and thin out this piece. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the bottom. You could see I'm removing only a minimal bit of material, using a very, very light touch so I don't go too deep, because adding on to this would be an option, but I did not want to do that. And then once I had that to the dimension I wanted, I used a series of sandpapers. I started with the belt sander, because that's going to work faster than the orbital, and I just cleaned all that up with, I probably had 80 grit on at this point. The nice thing about the belt sander is because it has this cylindrical end, it's really, really great way to get those curves. If you're doing curves, I could clean up my edges as well really quickly. You can see what nice quick work this belt sander is with shaping stuff. And then once I had that to the shape I wanted, I could go through and clean it up finally with the orbital and really feather it into that edge. So when I take this tape off, it looks almost seamless at that point. And that is basically what that looks like. Like I said, that tongue in that groove there makes for a really nice sturdy edge. If it's ever going to be hit or bumped, it's going to be that edge, which is one of the reasons I wanted it to be hardwood. So then I'm attaching these grommets to hold the shot glasses. I chose to do this because the easiest way would be to glue them on there, but I wanted them removable so it was easy to clean them. I'd found these grommets on Amazon. I'll try and remember to link them in the description. They hold the glasses. Now the problem with these is they were about the right thickness for this, but I had to have an 1/8 inch piece for the grommet to go around in the inner circle. So I basically have to cut out 2 separate circles, one for the hole and then one to hold that inner edge. That will make more sense once you see this. So basically I'm making a larger outer circle, and I'm only going about an 1/8 of an inch deep on each side. I'm not going all the way through. So that is what that's going to look like. That represents the circumference of the outer edge of that grommet. Then I could go through and remove the inner circle, which will represent where the inner circle of the grommet is and where the shot glass is going to go. The reason I did the outer circle first is you need a reference point for that drill bit to go through. If I drilled out this inner circle first and then tried to do the outer circle, this bit would just dance around on you. So you can see how I'm drilling out that outer circle. I like to flip these over. These drill bits these hole saw bits are a little bit old, on the older side, and even with something underneath of it, sometimes they tend to tear out. So flipping it over when you're almost through eliminates that. This is the one spot I messed up with the engraving. I lost part of the German Shepherd's ear there, but basically now you can see I could remove this little bit of an 1/8 inch material, and I essentially created a circular kerf by using that drill bit, and it will leave a little flange on the inside which coincides with the flange of the grommet, and then that will fit right into place. So that was how I did that. This is the whole thing laying out in my shop once I had all the circles done. And then I'm going to, like I said, this was actually getting some paint as well as a clear coat on the top. You can see I was pretty happy with how the shape turned out. So anything that was going to be painted, I put primer on first, which is proper practice. If you also have any sort of gaps in your tongue and groove, the nice thing about paint is you could patch all that and hide it. The back got spray painted, and then the lettering got painted black. And then at this point, I decided to glue in the grommets once everything was painted. So I'm just putting they hold in place really well, but I wanted them to be permanent. So I put a little bit of epoxy on there, and then you could see how they kind of, it's a little, you have to force them in there a little bit, but they fit into place. You could clean those up and then check to make sure the glasses fit in there. And then that's how I did the grommets. And then the top side got a coating of my current favorite finish, which is Osmo oil. This is also has some oils in it, so it will beat up water and alcohol, which is nice without having to clean this. It will be easy to clean. And then the edges I decided to paint with an epoxy black, and the edges of this as well as the edges of the ski. And that was basically it.